Hello and welcome back to Making It Political. I'm Zach
And I'm Gage.
and we're A-level politics students, and today we're going to be talking to you about the 2024 general election results. Of course, we're still waiting on one constituency to give us their results, but aside from that, it's pretty much done and dusted. So I wanted to start off this episode with our overall thoughts on the election, so I'll hand over to you for this one, Gage.
Okay, so my overall thoughts for this were not surprised at the winners, the main winners and the main losers of this general election, but rather the fringe parties that we've got and the smaller parties in our political system. And I think particularly Reform and the SNP have been the most fascinating. But if we're talking more on a small scale, I think that that I personally was slightly disappointed with the results, or at least not expecting the results that came out. I'd say in the same way, I'm not surprised, but that I'd say that it's different to what I expected.
No, I completely agree with you. I was planning to stay up all night to see what would happen, but the exit polls came out and it was pretty expected, so I didn't really feel the need to have to stay up and watch whatever news channel. And by the time I woke up, it was pretty much what had been predicted, except for Reform. But we'll come on to that later. Firstly, let's discuss this Labour landslide, 412 seats. Do you have any thoughts you want to share on that?
Probably the same as the rest of the country, in that it is definitely an astronomical victory for the Labour Party. We're talking Tony Blair level, not quite. Obviously, it's a few seats less, by about 9, I think, majority-wise. But I think personally it's slightly underperformed on the kind of more superficial scale. But in the grand scheme of things, I'd say the performance of the Labour Party has been partially reflective of a multitude of factors. I don't think it's down to one thing. I don't think it's all down to Keir Starmer. I don't think it's all down to the Conservative Party. I don't think it's down to auto reform. Ultimately, it's a combination of all these factors that have pitched in and, tarnished the reputation of the Conservative Party. And yes, and as you can see, that's kind of led to this huge victory that even with a smaller vote share within the Labour Party that they had under Jeremy Corbyn, they've achieved this massive majority. So yeah, I think I would like to know what your thoughts on the turnout and then also the vote share that the Labour Party had in comparison to the seats they gained.
Okay, well, with turnout, I was sort of thinking it would be higher than we'd seen before. 60% last time I checked is lower than 2019, the so-called Brexit election. And I feel like, I suppose part of it is that maybe some Conservative voters couldn't bring themselves to vote against. But I just find it interesting that it's a lower turnout, especially considering that given those weeks leading up to the election, there were so many 18 to 22-year-old bracket. So many of them were registering to vote for the first time. And I even heard that on the day that the polling stations were packed, at least they were first thing in the morning. So I thought it would be a lot higher. In terms of the Labour landslide, I do agree we were sort of led to believe we'd be getting more. I don't think, well, we were told it was going to happen. I never believed it. All this super majority talk, because I'm going to go on a bit of a rant here, but super majorities don't exist in our country because how would you even define that if a majority is where you have the most seats in Parliament, and so what the super majority would be, the party can do whatever they want. If that was the case, then technically Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, Boris Johnson, technically they would have all had super majorities as well. So that narrative sort of felt a bit weak for me. What you've already sort of touched on, and what I was going to ask you was, do we think Labour won, or do we think that the Tories lost? And I'd also like to link this to the Tony Blair election in 1997, see if it's sort of you think it's a similar situation?
In some ways, in regards, yes. In others, not so much. I think in both scenarios, the prior largest party, the Conservative Party in both cases, had abysmal records in their previous governments. You've got 14 years of Conservative scandals and failures and lies and incompetence. And in 1992, between 1992 and 1997, you've got John Major, who, just look at his track record. It is understandable that people in the United Kingdom want to change, and the Conservative Party got punished heavily for that. And then the similarities, I think the kind of situation of being in political turmoil, economic turmoil is definitely there. With main events like Black Wednesday, kind of being similar, in a way, being similar to certain economic policies we've had by one Liz Truss. And yeah, I think they have their similarities, but also I feel like with Tony Blair, people felt, I mean, I wasn't around, but I feel like people felt genuinely optimistic about the Tony Blair's Labour government, because he represented the change in society and politics. I don't think Keir Starmer represents that same thing. Now, it's understandable because of his policies and his manifesto that have been restricted by a stagnant economy. But then again, you could say the same about Tony Blair. He wasn't exactly in a great spot to begin with either, economically. So, yeah, it is hard to say, but I feel as though the 1997 case looks more optimistic than the modern 2024 general election case in those regards. But yeah, what about you?
I sort of disagree that people aren't feeling as optimistic as 1997. I'm feeling pretty optimistic about this Labour government. I do, however, feel that Keir Starmer's going to have a tough first term, because he's going to have to focus on fixing all the stuff that's gone wrong within the last 14 years rather than sort of changing and overhauling things like Tony Blair did. Yeah, I feel quite optimistic about this. I'm not. People were saying it was going to be a weight lifting off your shoulders. I haven't really felt that yet. I don't think I'm going to feel that until 2029, when we see whether or not Labour's going to get a second term, which we'll talk about that as and when. But I think maybe it's time to move on to the other parties now, talking about the biggest Conservative defeat in history. What are your thoughts on that? And my other points.
We'll go back to what you thought about the optimism. I feel as though, since the people who are most likely to vote being sort of in the older category, they have lived through 14 years of Conservative government, 13 years of Labour government, and then another 13 years of Conservatives before that. They've had the same old, and for them, I feel as though they might not be as optimistic. I feel like people our age might be, sure, but they haven't grown up really with the effects of things like the 2008 economic crisis, Black Wednesday, privatisation, deregulation on all these grand scales. And some people, I feel as though, I think it represents the turnout as well. I don't think it's that the Conservatives haven't turned out. Sure they have, and surely that's going to be the case in general, but I don't think that's going to warrant a case where you've got sort of 2001 voter apathy levels in comparison to 60% when the country generally wants change. That's like an understatement. And yet turnout's so low. It's kind of, I can see what you mean when you say you feel optimistic. But yeah, to me, it seems as though that kind of middle-aged group and the elderly, I've just felt the same thing for years and years and years, decades and decades. And there's no way they're going to feel optimistic about this government. They're going to wait and see whether they can trust it. And I think we'll have a real political crisis if the Labour government fails to change anything, because you'll see in the past 3-4 decades we've had the we've had the Conservatives, in starting with Margaret Thatcher, who took on economic turmoil, domestic turmoil, everything, you name it, and she, in her own way, tried to deal with that problem, whether you agree with her ways of doing it or not. There was no doubt it was definitely a change. It was a change. That was the important bit. And then followed by that, people got sick and tired after John Major. They voted Tony Blair. He was definitely a change. And then you look again, you go back to 2010. Once again, change. If the Labour government does not introduce that change that they are promising, even though their manifesto doesn't suggest it, and I feel as though to fix that optimism and trust in the two main parties, the Labour Party has to get on with their job of change and make sure that they do change. Otherwise, I feel as though we will have a real political crisis for those two parties. And we could see some very wild results at the next general election if things do not change as promised. And so what was your question?
I was just asking how you felt about the biggest Conservative defeat in history.
Oh, yes. I think it totally reflects the public attitude. There's no doubt about it. There's not much to say, really. It's not undeserved in a way. I don't think there's anyone ignorant enough to say that the Conservative government has benefited the country as a whole. So, yes, it's I'd say deserved and not surprising at all. Reflects public attitude and whatnot. So, yeah, there's my thoughts.
Yeah, I completely agree. It definitely reflects the public attitude after things like Partygate, more recently the betting scandal. People just can't trust the Conservatives anymore. But what I found particularly sort of emotive was maybe not emotive in the traditional sense, but Rishi Sunak's sort of final farewell speech. What we could see there was like a very tired man there who'd been fighting hard to sort of at least keep his seat. I know people have been saying that he called this election as a way to, get out, but you could see he'd definitely been campaigning hard. Whether or not that's gone well for him is, entirely up to your opinion or anyone else's opinion. But just you could see the weariness in his eyes as he gave that final speech before he went to go and see the King. Also, what was revealed during that speech, which not entirely surprising, was that he's going to step down as leader of the party when they find someone to replace him. What his plans after that are, I'm not sure. But what are your 2 cents on that?
I feel as though I might disagree with you. I feel as though the effort has definitely been there, but the public sentiment, whether that's my personal opinion or not, is that Rishi Sunak is out of touch. He cannot compare himself to the general public. I mean, I wasn't convinced. I thought maybe he'd inherited a bad problem until I saw the campaign, the Sky News interview. Sorry, not the Sky News, the interview where he said he went without Sky News. And I just think that's whether he really does care or not, because I'm sure he does deep down. But the way that he goes about it is not the right way, and the general public do not need someone like him in charge, unfortunately. And yeah, for his speech, weariness, I'm not sure. Yeah, I think the public sentiment is quite accurate, really. He is not representative. He's not elected by the people, for starters. He's way too wealthy, arguably. I mean, that's not a bad thing, but it does make you out of touch with people, or at least the public feel that way. But yeah, that's how I feel about the whole Rishi Sunak issue. And as for his resignation, his impending resignation, obviously, he will resign by convention. That's not going to be a surprise. When we see a new leader, I'm not sure, because if you're looking globally, the Conservative Party in Canada has been kind of in turmoil. I think they haven't had a leader in a year. So, leadership election, whenever or after they've sorted out their own turmoil. But yes, that's how I feel about Rishi Sunak.
I completely agree with you that Rishi Sunak is definitely out of touch with the public. I just found it sort of fascinating how tired and just completely shattered he looked when he was giving that speech. And yet when you saw Keir Starmer arrive from Buckingham Palace to number 10 Downing Street, the man looked jubilant. He looked like I've never seen him smile that much anytime I've watched him in anything. And it sort of shows this must have been a very positive campaign on the doorstep for Labour, and it must not have been for the Conservative. And even in the interviews leading up to the election, people were booing Rishi Sunak, yelling at him outside. And people have been quite positive towards Labour. I've seen that when I've been on the doorstep. You get the odd few who are still Conservative supporters and who aren't particularly nice to you, but it's just been a very positive experience for Labour this time around. And I just think comparatively, it's very interesting. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I completely agree with you there. He's had his defence up this entire campaign for obvious reasons. I think the jubilance is perfectly allowed in this situation. There's nothing unacceptable about that. He's done something absolutely insane politically, really, hasn't he? I do have a question for you. How do you feel the loss of major Conservative seats, the likes of Liz Truss and Jacob Rees-Mogg, and just so many, Grant Shapps, the list goes on. It really has been, as the news has been calling it, bingo. So how do you feel the loss of these seats represents the state that the Conservative Party is, and how the public feel, the electorate, feel about how the way they have led the country over the past 14 years?
I can't say I'm surprised that we saw a bit of a cabinet clear out. I am, and just general benches clear out. I will say a part of me is surprised that Rishi Sunak himself did not lose his seat, but I suppose it is a safe Tory seat. So Jacob Rees-Mogg was an interesting one to me because I haven't really heard about him in Rishi Sunak's term. I don't think he's been that prominent a figure unless I'm just out of touch myself. So I found that his name coming up again quite interesting. In terms of Liz Truss, I'm not surprised at all about that one. And she was late to her own count, wasn't she? And she looked very robotic.
Yes, she. I think they had to get her on stage. The electorate that were there. That was quite amusing. I was wondering something else as well. Now that Keir Starmer's got the kind of capabilities, I say capabilities, anyone with a majority can do anything, really. But how do you feel, due to the sheer size of the majority, how do you feel the style of Prime Minister, of Keir Starmer as Prime Minister will be in terms of his cabinet and his own personality? Do you feel he's going to take a heavy lead over his cabinet, maybe unite them? How do you feel the style of government that Keir Starmer will run will run?
I feel like that's a very difficult question to answer on day one. I do think, as much as I respect the man, I don't think he has quite the capabilities to be as presidential in style as Blair and Johnson were. And in terms of the cabinet, I think it's quite good to see it's the most working class cabinet we've ever had. And I feel like Keir Starmer wouldn't have carefully selected and constructed this cabinet just to ignore it and make them do whatever he says. I feel like even in his speech, he's definitely dedicated to serving the people. Or maybe I've just fallen victim to these quote unquote Labour lies. But no, I feel like there will be maybe not as strong a return, I'd say, but definitely somewhat of a return to cabinet for this one. And to come back to the first question you asked me before this about the loss of some major Tory seats, I do want to address that it's just testament to Labour's strategy this time. Because I think you'll have noticed when you look constituency by constituency, the Labour candidates don't have not in most constituencies, they don't have that many more votes than the other candidates, and that's due to their strategy of completely targeting the Tory seats. In fact, I think they even had it said they'd take a safe seat, and they'd have the people from the safe seat come up to maybe the neighbouring swing seat or potential swing seat this time and campaign there, which I think was a very good strategy. I think it worked well, and I think the results have paid out with their 412 seats.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from. Yeah. Besides that, I think we should move on to Reform and possibly the SNP before taking a short break. So, I suppose I want to ask you, how do you feel, first off, if you put your political opinion aside, to one side, how do you feel about the fact that the Reform Party, in total vote share, achieved more votes than the Liberal Democrats, but achieved, I think, 61 seats less than Reform? How do you feel this reflects the general election and the voting system overall?
Yeah, I feel like we're going to get into technical grounds with this question. Objectively, I think it's impressive for a sort of emerging party to get those, last time I checked, 5 seats that they got. I do think that is impressive. But even objectively, I feel like it's not great to have Reform sort of coming up. I think it spells trouble for Labour in the future if they don't deliver on this change.
Yeah. I'm going to interrupt you there because that brings you sort of linked to one of my earlier points about if the Labour government disappoints after consecutive decades of constant change and they don't offer that change, Reform have a real shot at taking over. And the same with the Liberal Democrats. It's going to be a battle between those two if the Labour Party do not deliver, or at least, how do I put this, do okay in office. So, sorry for interrupting, but yeah, that's definitely how I feel.
No, I completely agree. In terms of sort of reflecting on public, I feel like it is interesting because they're sort of also a party that was promising change. In fact, kind of the opposite direction of change to Labour, because there was talk of some form of privatisation to the NHS, which I think is interesting. So they've sort of, we'll call it the spoiler effect, because that's what it's called. But so the Conservative voters who want change have gone to have Reform has split the vote, because some Conservative voters have gone to Reform, and that's why they haven't done as well despite getting a higher vote share, because their support is so spread out. So, like, for example, you've got the popular figure of Farage in Clacton, which is why he won there, but elsewhere you don't exactly have those figures that people can rally behind. They just think, I want Nigel in, so I'm going to vote Reform. But then you've also got the Conservative voters who think they're going to stick to you've got the Conservative voters who think they're going to stick to their party. They think, I support them all the way. And you've also got Conservative voters who think Labour's the way to go and not Reform. And I think that's interesting because it sort of shows, I suppose it especially links to 2019 when we had this massive flock of support to the Conservatives, including from the working class, which is not very typical. So I feel like the working class people who voted Conservative may have been swayed over to Labour and some Reform, and then some more of the perhaps better off people have gone to Reform, completely splitting the vote from the Conservatives, and explain the higher vote share compared to the Lib Dems. You got any thoughts on that?
No, not particularly. Obviously, we're going to have to wait for the actual statistics to come out around this, which will be very interesting to see the updated textbooks next year. But yeah, besides Reform, I think the other shock result, well, not necessarily shock result, but more punishing result, it's probably the SNP. You can't say the Conservatives have done badly until you see the percentage loss in seats that the SNP have had. Now, the reasons for this vary wildly. Some, I would argue that the main reason that Labour have done so well in Scotland is because of their they are the only other option that isn't the SNP or Conservatives. Anything to get the Tories out is kind of the general feel in Scotland. It's quite a progressive country, nation. So yeah, the main reasons for it, if you don't know, obviously it's very complicated in Scotland with issues of independence, Brexit. You've got you've got healthcare issues, falling behind in education, the highest drug death in Europe, in terms of rates. It's complicated, especially with the SNP scandals and change of leadership and just the complete turmoil the SNP have had. It is literally comparable to what has happened to the Conservative Party. And it's hard to try and pinpoint the main reasons for why this has happened. Once again, I feel as though this result is a combination of factors, but the Scottish people tend to be a lot more punishing in their general elections than the English and Welsh are. So yes, they've got 9 seats, I believe. At the minute, depending on what last seat, and yeah, it's going to be quite the shake up in Scotland, and there are some people arguing that it would quash the cause of independence, and then some former SNP voters and even the former SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon saying this isn't about independence. The independence cause is still there in people. They just might not think it's the right time, or they just want to get the Conservatives out of Scotland. So I don't know how you feel about this. So I'm gonna let you chatter away.
Yeah, obviously, I don't know as much about Scotland as you, but I do find it quite interesting. I do think Labour could not have gotten as big a majority without the loss of support for the SNP in Scotland.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it does raise some interesting questions about the nationalist sentiment there. Well, I don't think it's completely gone. I think people are just doing everything they can to get the Tories out right now. But I think we'll talk about the sort of nationalist sentiments of the different regions of the UK a bit later. But yeah, SNP, it's very interesting because now Lib Dems are back to being the 3rd largest party, which, it feels kind of right to me because I always thought Lib Dems were the 3rd largest party until I looked at the textbook and I realised,
yes,
SNP.
The Liberal Democrats unfortunately have not been the 3rd largest party since I think 2010. 2015, could be 2010. I'm sorry, I don't know. But yes, the SNP has really taken a hit. Now, obviously, you've got critics saying this is the end of the nationalist movement in Scotland. I would go out of my way and say that is complete rubbish. That's not going to be the case. That will never be the case, because nationalist sentiment in people does not just walk out the door as soon as another government goes in. No, it just boils up. It boils up, and when the Labour Party make a mistake, what do the Scottish people realise? They realise Labour can't do it. Conservatives can't do it. We're just going to vote the SNP, whether they are voting the SNP for independence or not. They just want their country to benefit. So it's the same issue as with England and Wales and Northern Ireland. If the Labour Party do not deliver we will see a huge upheaval at the next general election. That would be what I would predict, massive upheaval. So, although talking about that, I feel as though the sheer size of the majority will provide quite a lot of safety to the Labour Party, as seen by many of the successive governments of, Margaret Thatcher in her second and third term, and Tony Blair. It gives you a lot of cushion. It also gives you a lot of influence, gives you more funding. So it gives you a lot more power to work with, and makes it a little bit easier, I'd say. So, yeah, I feel as though the cushion in majority size will keep the Labour Party in for at least another term. I know that's very, very, very early to say, literally day one, but that is just how the chances of this is going to play out unless something severely terrible happens to the Labour Party.
Yes, we will be taking a break, and when we get back, we're going to be speaking more about the Lib Dems. We're going to touch on Wales, the Green Party, and a little bit on Northern Ireland, and then we'll also be discussing what the future holds after this election. So we'll be back after this break. Okay, and we are back from our break. And before we continue on to the other parties, Gage, I just want to quickly remark on one last thing about Reform, how the exit polls were quite generous, giving them that 14-seat prediction, and in actuality, they've only got 5. Anything you want to add to that?
Yes, I think a little bit. Obviously, different news channels had put them between about 13 and 15. But generally that was kind of the consensus. When I first saw it, I was kind of stunned because I couldn't name more than 3 candidates. I think it's Lee Anderson, Richard Tice, and Nigel Farage. And I was kind of stunned that any more than that. I thought even Richard Tice would struggle to win it at his seat. So to see that the news believed that. Well, sorry, no, the exit poll suggested that Reform would win at 13. I think ultimately, it really does show 2 things. I think, one, the desire for change. People who voted Reform are proud to go out and say they voted Reform. And I feel like in a lot of those constituencies where because obviously exit polls are they're not, you're not forced to say an answer. You've got a lot of people who won't answer, or you'll get people who will lie. And I think in those a lot of those Reform exit poll victory suggestions, you've got these people who are either too ashamed to say that they're going to vote for another party, or they just won't say at all. And then you've got the Reform who are proud and will say that they want change. So I think that reflects the kind of public sentiment further. But yeah, I was definitely shocked to see such a high, like the high end of the MRP poll kind of predictions of Reform candidates. But yeah, they're my thoughts. That the exit polls are quite tarnishing of the current political system we've got, really. So yeah, they're my thoughts, I'd say.
Yeah, well, we mentioned this earlier, but Reform got a higher vote share than the Lib Dems. So let's smoothly segue into the Liberal Democrats. The first thing I want to mention is actually Ed Davey's constituency himself, itself. He has a very comfortable majority in that seat. He had 25,000 odd votes compared to whoever came in second, which was Conservative. They only had 8,000. That is a massive victory for Ed Davey, and yeah, I think it's sort of showing not just tactical voting, but how popular his campaign made him, which, depending on what side of the coin you fall, it was either a really good campaign for himself and the Lib Dems, or it was sort of ridiculous and you didn't really know what he was talking about. I mean, he did try and link everything to a policy, but I do feel in some cases he certainly lost the policy in what he was doing.
I'm a little bit unsure because once again we don't know the statistics yet. But a lot of these Lib Dem seats have come from Conservative voters. And that begs the question for everything. It's always a question, and one that definitely can't be answered because it's all subjective. But I feel as though politics is much less down to campaign. I think campaign can make, as shown by kind of Rishi Sunak's, if you look at how many seats they lost during the campaign on Sky News, they said that they lost over 30 additional seats, like since the general election was called. And that's, I feel as though I would argue that the Lib Dems' success is less down to the successful campaign of Ed Davey. Because a lot of people, like I said, I feel as though the general attitude, supported by the turnout as well, is that we're not as optimistic as like me and you are, but the general public is probably more pessimistic due to all the reasons I stated before the break. And yet politics, I feel like politics is general elections are won by the policy, generally speaking. So I think, the campaign definitely benefited him, but the numbers that he got, as in from obviously the same Sky News poll that predicted that the Conservatives had lost over 30 seats since the general election was announced, and the Lib Dems had gained over 23, I think, since it was announced. I feel as though that was more due to the very, very typical and not surprised. It's always happened after a general election is called. Announced, the two main parties lose a lot of the quite a few points in the polls. So I feel as though it's not surprising to see. I feel like it's quite generic, but you've also got to add in the Tory failures, and that sort of led to that massive Lib Dem seat share in comparison to kind of average. So I personally think his campaign has been successful, sure, but at the end of the day, I would argue that it's more to do with the Conservative failures just based off of where the Lib Dems picked up those seats. But I could definitely be wrong.
Yeah, the campaign certainly got people talking about the Lib Dems, which is certainly a victory for them, I feel. One thing I do want to touch on was, I think I mentioned this in the last episode, that there were some people who were hoping for a Liberal Democrat opposition, which could have been glorious. But when I was out, door knocking with Labour yesterday, I was actually talking to someone about this, and a Lib Dem opposition might have actually been bad for Labour, because Lib Dems and Labour are more likely to agree on a lot of things than Labour and Conservative, and if they agree a lot, like, it sort of inadvertently furthers this narrative that people are already starting to believe that all politicians are the same, and that whilst everything has shifted more towards the centre, because that's how you win votes, it sort of furthers this narrative that maybe there's no point in voting, which we've seen because the turnout dropped by, is it 8% or something like that? It's 60% this time, which is lower than last time. So whether people don't see a point, whether they're just Conservative voters sort of abstaining because they can't bring themselves to vote for another party, I'm not quite sure. But do you have any thoughts you want to share on that?
Yeah, definitely. I'm not sure I agree that it would harm the kind of... I feel as though, yes, the sentiment is all parties can be the same if that was the case, but I feel as though it would benefit Labour, whatever the general public think about it, because if you're agreeing on a lot of things, where does that leave that line of scrutiny? With Labour and Conservative, you've got traditional, deep-rooted kind of feuds between the two parties, PMQs, conferences, I feel as though if they agreed on a lot of things, sure, that might help the Lib Dems out, but ultimately it's Labour who take all the credit at the end of the day for doing it, for doing the work. So I feel as though it would be less effective levels of scrutiny of the Labour government, who already have such a comfortable majority. That level of scrutiny is going to be heavily reduced. So from the House of Commons perspective, anyway. That's my thoughts on it. I think we should move on to our next point.
Just to interrupt before we move on, I do sort of want to counter what you said. I feel like it is important for people to see scrutiny in the House of Commons, whether that's from PMQs or otherwise. So, whilst they do have the majority to do whatever they want, I do feel like it is somewhat important for people to see that actually there is some scrutiny going on here with their policies rather than just two parties sort of agreeing on maybe not a majority of policies, but certainly on more than the Conservatives would agree with Labour on. I feel like whilst it is a bit of a circus on PMQs, the fact that there are two distinct sides does sort of show the public that, well, the government is being challenged. Whether or not I agree with Conservative as opposition is a different matter, but I do think it's important for the public to see some scrutiny. But yes, moving on to our next topic, the Greens, who did quite well for a smaller party, gaining 3 seats.
With the Green Party, they obviously did better than expected. I'm quite surprised they held on to Brighton. Congratulations for them. Their campaign, once again, I feel like they're an example of where the campaign... You see, they've gained, yet they've had quite a lack of coverage and funding for this campaign compared to the other parties, and yet have done really well for themselves. Maybe it shows the shifting attitudes we have towards political parties in the UK. But generally speaking, I feel like they've done really well for themselves. But that's, once again, I think massively down to people being sick and tired of Labour and Conservative governments, particularly the Conservatives, have taken over those kind of rural areas. Was it Herefordshire? I think that's Conservative history. I could be wrong. And then some others as well. So yeah, that's my thoughts on it. I don't want to delve too deep into that because I don't know enough, and also we haven't seen much coverage of them. There isn't too much to discuss.
Yeah, I agree. I do think it's interesting. Aren't both the Green leaders have a seat now? I think having 2 leaders would have been a recipe for disaster if it was a larger party. And in terms of coverage, it is certainly a problem because we're supposed to have impartial broadcast media. Yet, if Nigel Farage farted in a bath, journalists would come running to see how big a splash it made. But that's a topic for another time.
Yeah, I feel as though that's definitely something for another time, because you've got, like, you would have thought the biggest parties have the most coverage, but Nigel Farage has had the most coverage, and it does show the personality of leader does have a significant influence over certain factors such as the campaign, influence over the media. But I'm delving into another matter. So yes, yeah.
Yes. So our next topic to touch on is we mentioned a sort of bit of nationalism earlier. So I want to briefly mention Wales and Northern Ireland, which are sort of my weak areas of knowledge. But Plaid Cymru did make some gains in Wales. So it could be argued they have a 2-party system there now because, it's quite a small area. Do you have any thoughts on Wales in particular?
I haven't looked too deeply into Wales just yet. I'm looking at England, Scotland mostly. But what I can say is it does show, once again, the growth of nationalist movements that occur in spurts rather than general trickles because of poor governing by political parties. And it does show a potential shift in attitudes. And the big question is, once those nationalist movements start, will they ever stop? Because once that ball gets rolling down the hill, there's nothing stopping it. In the past, anyway, we're talking.
Well, to interrupt that, you say it won't be stopped. Sort of Scotland's nationalist movement was sort of forced to stop by, I think it was the Supreme Court ruling that they couldn't actually decide a matter that affected the whole union. And also just...
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt there because I feel as though, since I know a little bit more about Scotland, I can probably do that for this, because the whole idea of a nationalist movement doesn't have to be based off of voting behaviour. It's a very Westminster thing to say. If you're not Scottish, or you don't delve into why the Scots are, like, for example, this time around voting Labour, it's not because they don't want independence or because they've just stopped being nationalistic in sentiment, having a nationalistic sentiment. It's more of they have other reasons for getting the SNP out because of the SNP turmoil or Conservatives out that they want out. So it's not quelling this nationalist movement at all, really. If or anything, it might even help it. So
No.
yeah,
I agree. It's not stopped like with the people, but in terms of the politics, it's been forced to simmer down a bit in terms of referendums and such. Back to Wales, I have some specifics now. Plaid Cymru have gained 2 seats. And if you look at the map, there are absolutely no Conservative seats in Wales. It's just Plaid Cymru, Labour, and 1 Lib Dem seat.
Yeah, obviously Wales has been Labour. Interesting to see the rise of nationalist movements. The areas at which I think it's more of a geographical interest to me, the areas of which have voted for the Welsh Nationalist Party. We haven't stated, I don't think that they want to go for independence, but more to protect Welsh culture. Now, obviously, that begs a question, is that just a stepping stone and then it'll eventually go further and further? You know, the people that argue that devolution would just feed the issue, and maybe it has, as we see today. But it does show the growth of nationalist sentiment in certain fed-up areas. But I don't think that Wales ever will get independence. And if it does, it probably won't be in our lifetime. So yeah, there's not much to say about Wales, I don't think. Maybe if we look at the candidates more in depth at some point, but that's for another time. I think Northern Ireland's probably of more interest. So there's obviously a lot of kind of unionist seats switching hands. I'll be careful what I say here because sensitive issues, but it does seem that potentially we're getting some. I think the Alliance gained a few seats, and some slightly more extremist unionist parties might have gained them from the more moderate ones. I'm not sure, but I think that's what happened. I mean, Northern Ireland's forever going to be complicated to understand, but all I can say is it reflects the issues we've had over power sharing since the government has been suspended for so many. Their assembly has been suspended so many times. The big one being 2021 to 2023, I think, or 2020 to 2022. Obviously, it's quite irritating to have a functioning devolved government. So it's unsurprising to see changes, and particularly people taking a more anti-sectarian parties, and some taking more extremist. So it's more extreme. Sorry, not extremist. But yeah, that's all I can say on Northern Ireland.
No, I completely agree with you on your points about Wales not getting independence anytime soon, and with Northern Ireland. Certainly 4 seats have changed hands. But so I think that brings us on to maybe the end of the episode, unless you have any other thoughts you want to share.
Not that I can think of. Yeah, I think I'm all done.
Okay then, so I think we should give 2 concluding points each about what we can take away from this general election, and then we'll do our outro. So my 2 points would be we've certainly seen a resurgence of the Lib Dems, so that'll be something to keep watching, perhaps over the next 5 years, and see how that influences the 2029 election. I know it's a bit premature to be talking about the next election when this is literally the day after 2024 one, and we're still waiting on one constituency to be announced. But my second point would be also that we need to keep an eye on reform. Not in a hostile way, just I think it's going to be interesting to see whether they gain or lose support over these next 5 years, and certainly whether they get bigger after the next election or if they lose seats. Because in Nigel Farage's words, they're coming for Labour, which is a bit ridiculous with a 4 to 412 seat ratio, but I think they're certainly going to take advantage if Labour make any mistakes. What are your 2 points?
I think the SNP will be back, especially if Labour mess up. That nationalist movement definitely hasn't died, and the Conservatives have got to certainly restart. It'll be very fascinating to see how they change. I think what will happen is they'll probably take a further right Conservative leader. I'm not sure which one just yet. I just feel as though they're going to take a more hardline approach to combat the kind of reform vote stealing that's been going on. I also think that they won't be back in government for at least another 10 years. So, yeah, they're my 2 points.
Okay, then. So, with our concluded points, I want to thank everyone for listening, especially to 2 people who are very tired after pulling some late nighters. So, thank you all very much for listening to Making It Political, our student-run podcast, and this was our sort of coverage of the 2024 election.
And yeah, that's goodbye from me as well. So yeah, have a good one, folks.